He was forced to wash dishes at the party, but they didn't know his millionaire wife owned the mansion, and what happened when everyone discovered their plan will impress you. Now hit like, subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers, and let's get to the story. The Friday afternoon sun filtered through the silk curtains of the master bedroom in the mansion in Beverly Hills. Isabella Adams watched David from the doorway of the walk-in closet, her arms crossed over the Armani suit he was still wearing after a business meeting. Her eyes followed her husband's every movement as he carefully separated the simplest clothes he owned. "Are you sure about this, David?" Her voice carried a mixture of concern and curiosity. $300 million is no joke. If I invest it in the wrong place. David looked up from the wardrobe, holding a faded blue polo shirt he hadn't worn in years. The fabric was simple, a far cry from the imported materials he had grown accustomed to wearing since marrying Isabella. His fingers brushed the rough cotton, and a determined smile curved his lips. "Bella, you told me about that deal in D.C. How those investors seemed perfect at business dinners, talking about ethics and values." He turned completely to her, the shirt still in his hands. "And then you discovered they embezzled $15 million from the first project." Isabella sighed, remembering the betrayal that had almost destroyed her empire 5 years earlier. It had been David who helped her uncover the scheme, using the exact same strategy he was proposing now. "But this time it's different," she argued, walking to the Italian leather armchair in the center of the closet. "These are established business owners from New York. Veronica Williams has been organizing elite events for decades. Edward Miller has been building skyscrapers all over the city." "Exactly." David began to remove the Patek Philippe watch from his wrist. "They're powerful, and powerful people reveal their true character when they believe they're dealing with someone inferior." He placed the watch in its velvet box. "When they met me at the hotel, I was just a manager. Do you remember how you treated me in that first conversation?" Isabella smiled, recalling their meeting during the business convention. She had gotten lost in the hotel's corridors and asked David for directions. Even after discovering who she was later, he had remained genuinely polite and helpful. "You asked about my family," she murmured, "not about my business. And when you found out I was just a hotel employee, you didn't change your tone of voice one bit." David chose a pair of simple dark jeans. "That's why I fell in love with you, Bella. Your character is consistent, no matter who is in front of you." Isabella stood, walking up to him. Her hands touched David's chest, feeling the tense muscles beneath the dress shirt he was still wearing. "What if they find out? What if someone recognizes me from the catering company?" "They won't." David covered her hands with his. "I hired Elegant Events 3 weeks ago. I told them I was an administrative assistant at an investment firm. I used a fake name, a bank account in the name of our shell company." He kissed her forehead softly. "They believe they're organizing a networking party to attract a mysterious millionaire investor. And I'm that mysterious investor." "Exactly. You arrive at 9 p.m. when I've already observed how they treat a common employee for hours." David's eyes shone with determination. "If they pass the test, you invest the $300 million. If they fail, we cancel everything and find other partners," Isabella completed. David nodded, grabbing a basic white t-shirt. "It's a 20-year investment, Bella. It's worth knowing who we're dealing with." Isabella watched her husband change clothes, slowly transforming from a well-dressed executive into an ordinary worker. The transformation was impressive. Not just the clothing, but his entire body language changed. His shoulders hunched slightly, his chin lowered. Even his way of walking became more submissive. "Where did you learn to do that?" she asked, fascinated. "In my childhood." David adjusted the t-shirt, checking himself in the full-length mirror. "My mom worked as a housekeeper for rich families. I would go with her during school breaks and observe." His expression hardened. "I saw how some people treated their staff well in front of guests, but were cruel when they felt comfortable. And others? Others were genuinely kind, no matter who was watching." He smiled at her through the mirror. "Like you." Isabella came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "Promise me you'll leave the party if it gets too humiliating." David turned in her arms, studying his wife's worried face. His hands caressed her cheeks, a thumb tracing the line of her jaw with infinite tenderness. "Bella, I survived managing a hotel for 15 years. I dealt with drunk guests, furious clients, impossible situations." He kissed her lips softly. "One night with some arrogant business people isn't going to break me, but it might break my heart to see you humiliated. Then remember it's temporary, and that it has a bigger purpose." David checked the clock on the wall, a discreet Cartier, that would remain his only expensive piece, hidden under his t-shirt sleeve. 6 p.m. I need to be there at 6:30. Isabella took a deep breath, nodding. Okay. But David. Yes? If someone crosses the line, if the humiliation goes beyond what's tolerable, her eyes shone with fierce determination. I won't just cancel the investments. I'll destroy their careers. David smiled, recognizing the ruthless businesswoman he had fallen in love with. That's why I love you, Isabella Adams. It's still Isabella Thompson, thank you. She smiled back. I didn't change my last name after we got married, remember? As if I could forget the woman who said her name was already on the entrance of 2 commercial buildings and she wasn't going to change it for anyone. They laughed together, momentarily easing the tension that hung over their risky plan. David finished dressing, putting his wallet, keys, and phone in different pockets than usual. Every detail of the transformation had been meticulously planned. The catering company's van will pick me up on the corner in 5 minutes, he said, checking the time one last time. Isabella walked him to the mansion's front door, watching him walk down the tree-lined driveway until he disappeared around the corner. Only then did she allow genuine worry to take over her expression. God protect my husband, she murmured, touching her wedding ring. And give me the strength to destroy anyone who hurts him. But it would be David who needed all his strength in the coming hours, for he had no idea of the level of cruelty he was about to face. David adjusted his t-shirt one last time, before walking toward the white van parked on the corner of Rodeo Drive. The driver, a middle-aged man in a uniform from Elegant Events, waved from the window. Are you David? New temporary employee? Yes, sir. David modulated his voice, adopting a slightly more submissive but not overly exaggerated tone. He had learned over the years that genuine humility was more convincing than obvious acting. He got into the passenger seat, immediately noticing the lively conversations of the other employees in the back. 3 women and 2 men, all wearing uniforms identical to his, were discussing the details of the party that night. First time with Elegant? Asked one of the women, a grey-haired lady who appeared to be a veteran in the business. First time, David confirmed. I really need the work. The phrase wasn't a lie, just contextualized differently. He really did need that job, not for the money, but for the information he would get about his wife's potential business partners. Then you don't know Mrs. Williams, one of the men commented, making a face. Be prepared to work hard, brother. She doesn't go easy on male employees. David raised an eyebrow, genuinely interested. What do you mean? She has specific preferences about who does what, the older woman explained, lowering her voice conspiratorially. Women handle serving, reception, more visible things. Men go to the kitchen, cleaning, moving things. Basically, the second man added, if it's heavy, invisible work, it's for us. David nodded, absorbing the information. He was already starting to form an impression of Veronica Williams, and it wasn't a positive one. The van meandered through the streets of Beverly Hills, passing by establishments David frequented regularly as an executive. He saw the restaurant where he and Isabella had dinner the week before, the art gallery where they bought a piece last month. The irony of the situation was not lost on him. It's a big party today, the driver commented. House in Bel Air, people with a lot of money. What do you know about the guests? David asked casually. Business owners from New York, the older woman replied. Mrs. Williams was very nervous today because apparently a very important investor is coming. Something about millions of dollars. David smiled internally. Isabella had done a good job of creating anticipation for her participation. The van parked in front of an imposing mansion in Bel Air. David recognized the classical architecture, the marble pillars, the meticulously manicured garden. It was the kind of property where he and Isabella were frequently invited for social events. Employee entrance is through the back, the driver instructed. Mrs. Williams doesn't like guests seeing the staff arrive. The employees got out of the van and were led down a side path to the back of the property. David observed everything carefully. The layout of the rooms, the entrances and exits, the spots where he could observe without being noticed. Veronica Williams was waiting for them in the back patio, a 45-year-old woman impeccably dressed in a Chanel suit. Her blonde hair was pulled back in an elegant bun, and her red lipstick highlighted her thin lips. She held a clipboard and examined each employee with a critical eye. "You're late," was her first sentence, despite them being right on time. "Sorry, Mrs. Williams," the driver hurried to say. "Traffic was—" "I don't want excuses," she cut in, her eyes scanning the group until they stopped on David. "You," she said, pointing at him. "Are you the new one?" "Yes, ma'am." Veronica examined him from head to toe, as if evaluating cattle at an auction. David maintained his slightly hunched posture, avoiding direct eye contact, exactly what he had observed staff doing when he was in a position of power. Name? David Thompson. He used his wife's last name to maintain consistency with the fake documentation. Previous experience? General help, ma'am, loading, cleaning, whatever is needed. Good, because today you're going to work a lot. She made a note on her clipboard. High-class party, important guests. I don't want to see any of you in the social area unless it's strictly necessary for the service. David nodded along with the other employees, but internally he registered every word. The segregation was deliberate and humiliating. Maria, Veronica called the older employee, you're responsible for the coordination. Distribute the tasks as we discussed. Yes, Mrs. Williams. Veronica left, leaving Maria to organize the team. The woman sighed softly before addressing the group. Guys, you know how it works. Anna and Clara, you'll be on service, guest reception and circulating drinks in the social area. Robert and... She looked at David. David, you're going to the heavy-duty area. Moving furniture, transporting equipment, general cleaning. Robert, a man in his 30s with defined muscles, patted David's shoulder. We'll work together then. At least it's not just me this time. What's the worst part? David asked as they headed inside the house. When the guests arrive, Robert replied in a low voice. Then they start asking for specific things, like things they could ask the girls, but they prefer to have the men do it. What kind of things? You'll see. They entered the mansion's kitchen, a large space with state-of-the-art appliances and a central marble island. Dozens of boxes were waiting to be unpacked. Chairs needed to be transported. Furniture required rearranging. David rolled up his sleeves and started working. His muscles, kept in shape by years of private training, responded easily to the physical demands. Carrying boxes, moving furniture, organizing equipment, all of it was infinitely easier than managing crises at a five-star hotel. But as the hours passed and the first guests began to arrive, David realized that Robert was right. The real difficulty wouldn't be physical. It would be emotional and psychological. And it was just beginning. At 7:30 p.m., the first guests began to arrive. David watched discreetly through the pass-through between the kitchen and the main hall, recognizing some faces from the business section of the newspapers. Edward Miller was the first to enter, an imposing man of 50, wearing an impeccable tuxedo and exuding arrogance with every step. Robert, Maria called softly, Mrs. Williams wants you guys to organize the bar. Some boxes of whiskey just arrived. David followed Robert to a pantry in the back of the kitchen, where several boxes of imported liquor were waiting. Macallan, 25-year-old, Hennessy Paradis, Dom Perignon Vintage, a collection that cost more than many people's annual salary. Be careful with these, Robert murmured, lifting a box of whiskey. Each bottle costs more than my car. David nodded, taking a box and walking toward the bar. It was ironic to be carrying drinks that he himself had in his personal cellar, but the experience gave him a unique perspective on how the truly rich treated those they considered inferior. On the way to the bar, he passed through the main hall, where Edward Miller was talking animatedly with two other men. David recognized one of them, Marcus Taylor, owner of a hotel chain, the same kind of establishment where David had worked for 15 years before meeting Isabella. Problem with employees these days, Edward was saying, is that they no longer know their place. David slowed his pace, pretending to adjust his load to listen better. Exactly, Marcus agreed. The other day I had to fire a receptionist because he was talking to guests as if he were their equal, talking about politics, economics. A simple employee, and a man at that, Edward added. At least the women know how to be discreet when serving. Men always want to show off, give their opinion. David kept walking, but every word was etched in his memory. These were the men Isabella planned to do $300 million in business with. At the bar, David began organizing the drinks under the supervision of Anna, one of the employees assigned to serving. She was explaining where each type of drink should go when Veronica approached. Anna, can you go check if the flowers in the hall are well arranged? Veronica asked, but her eyes were fixed on David. You, she said, pointing at him, finish organizing the bar alone. David nodded, continuing to arrange the bottles on the shelves. He felt Veronica's eyes on him, evaluating, judging every move. Have you worked high-end events before? She asked after a few minutes. No, ma'am. Mostly manual labor, I can tell. Her voice carried a tone of superiority that David recognized well. He had dealt with guests like this for years. Well, I hope you understand that tonight is extremely important. We have very influential guests, including an investor who can mean millions for their businesses. I understand perfectly, Mom, and I hope you know how to behave appropriately. No trying to make conversation with guests. No giving unsolicited opinions. No—" She paused, looking him up and down one more time. "No trying to act like you're more than you are." David felt his blood boil, but he kept his expression neutral. "Yes, Mom, I'll just do my job." "Good." Veronica walked away, but not before adding, "And remember, you're here to serve, not to be noticed." As he finished organizing the bar, David reflected on the interaction. There was something specifically cruel in the way Veronica emphasized his supposed inferiority. It wasn't just about professional hierarchy, it was about systematic humiliation. At 8 o'clock, the hall was full. David circulated through the back of the party, performing minor tasks as requested, but mostly observing. He saw Edward Miller snapping his fingers to call Robert, as if he were a pet. He saw Marcus making jokes about men who couldn't make it in life, while discreetly pointing at David. But it was Patricia Jones who took the cruelty to another level. She arrived at 8:15, an elegant woman of 40, owner of a chain of luxury hotels. David recognized her immediately. They had almost closed a partnership between his and her companies years ago, but the deal didn't go through. Patricia was talking to Veronica when she spilled red wine on her dress. "Oh, how annoying," she exclaimed. "I need to clean this before it stains." "Don't worry," Veronica said, looking around until her eyes found David. "You," she called, snapping her fingers. "Come here." David approached, maintaining the submissive posture he had adopted. "Mrs. Jones needs her dress cleaned immediately," Veronica explained. "Go get some water and vinegar from the kitchen and take care of it." David nodded, but Patricia interrupted him. "Actually," she said, examining David with sudden interest, "you seem careful. How about you do it right here? I'm in a hurry." David looked around. They were in the social area, surrounded by guests. Patricia's suggestion was clearly to humiliate him publicly. "Mom, maybe it would be better in a more private place." "I said here," Patricia cut in, her voice acquiring a cold tone. "Unless you're not capable of doing a simple job." Edward and Marcus approached, apparently attracted by the possibility of entertainment at David's expense. "Problem, Patricia?" Edward asked, smiling. "This employee is questioning my instructions," she replied, looking directly at David. "Maybe he doesn't understand that when an important person asks for something, it should be done immediately." David felt every fiber of his being screaming to reveal who he really was, to expose the hypocrisy and cruelty of these people, but he remembered the bigger objective, protecting Isabella's investments. "My apologies, ma'am. I'll get the cleaning materials right away." "Good," Patricia smiled with satisfaction. "And be quick. Important people don't like to wait." As David walked toward the kitchen, he heard Edward comment loudly enough for him to hear, "That's exactly what I'm talking about with failed men. They have no dignity whatsoever." David clenched his fists, but kept walking. He had no idea that the worst was yet to come. David returned from the kitchen carrying a tray with cleaning products, water and vinegar, and absorbent cloths. The small circle around Patricia had grown. Now it included 6 people, all watching with morbid interest what was about to happen. "Finally," Patricia said theatrically, extending the hem of her dress toward him. "We hope you know what you're doing." David knelt on the Italian marble floor, feeling the cold of the stones through the fabric of his jeans. The muffled laughter around him was audible, even though the guests tried to maintain some social discretion. "Be careful not to spread the stain," Veronica instructed, clearly enjoying the spectacle. "That dress cost more than you make in a year." David began to work on the stain, applying the vinegar with careful movements. He had learned the technique years ago, when he managed similar situations at the hotel. The irony was that he probably had more experience with fine fabrics than anyone in that circle. "You're slow," Edward commented, checking the Rolex watch on his wrist. "In my construction business, a slow worker is an unemployed worker." "Maybe he's not used to quality materials," Marcus suggested, causing more laughter. "He must usually clean cheap clothes." David took a deep breath, continuing his work. The stain was coming out, but every second he spent kneeling on the floor, surrounded by people who were amused by his supposed humiliation, tested his limits of self-control. "Done, Mom," he said finally, standing up and stepping back a few feet. Patricia examined the dress critically, turning at different angles while the group watched. "It's not perfect," she declared, pointing to an area that hadn't even been stained. "I still see a mark here." David looked where she was pointing. There was no mark at all. "Ma'am, I don't see—" "Are you questioning my vision?" Patricia interrupted, her voice rising a notch. Maybe you need glasses. Or maybe you don't know how to do your job properly. Edward stepped forward, placing a hand on David's shoulder with excessive force. Buddy, when a lady says there's a problem, there's a problem. Got it? David felt the pressure of Edward's fingers, a clearly intimidating gesture. Yes, sir. Then fix it, Edward ordered, pushing him slightly toward Patricia. David knelt again, pretending to work on a non-existent stain. The group of observers had grown even larger, and the side conversations were a symphony of humiliation. At least he's obedient. He must be used to kneeling. Good, that some still know their place. When he finally stood up for the second time, David saw Veronica approaching with an expression of fake concern. Patricia, dear, I'm so sorry for the inconvenience, she said, casting a cold glance at David. This is a temporary employee, clearly not used to our quality standards. No problem, Patricia replied graciously, but her eyes shone with malice. It was educational to observe how some people work. The group gradually dispersed, but not before David overheard more comments. Imagine if he were our employee. I would have fired him already. Luckily, we have more competent people in our companies. David collected the cleaning materials, keeping his head down. When he headed back to the kitchen, Veronica intercepted him. One moment, she said, pulling him into a more secluded corner. I need to make something very clear. David turned to her, waiting. This party is crucial for my career. The guests tonight represent millions of dollars in contracts. Her voice was low but venomous. If you for any reason cause any additional embarrassment, I guarantee you will never work in events in New York again. I understand, ma'am. I doubt you do. She moved closer, invading his personal space. Men like you think you can question, argue, show what you can do. But here you are invisible, do you hear me? Your job is to do what you're told, when you're told, without questioning. David nodded, but Veronica wasn't finished. And one more thing, she continued. If by any chance the investor we're waiting for notices any inadequacy in the service, I guarantee the consequences will be severe. What kind of consequences? The kind that failed men like you can't afford to find out. She walked away, leaving David alone with the weight of her words. He knew the threats were empty. Veronica had no real power over his life. But for someone in the position he was pretending to hold, those words would be devastating. Returning to the kitchen, David found Robert organizing trays of canapes. How's your first night going? Robert asked, noticing David's tense expression. Interesting, David replied diplomatically. You're doing well. I've seen new employees run out of here after half an hour with this crowd. Why? What do they do? Robert paused, looking around to make sure they were alone. They test the limits. See how far they can push before we break. He lowered his voice even more. Last week they made a colleague polish a guest's shoes while the guy was wearing them. On the floor in front of everyone. David's stomach churned. And he did it? He needed the money. He has 3 kids. Robert sighed. But he left here vowing he would never come back. And you can't complain? To who? Veronica is well connected. A word from her and you're marked in the industry. Robert picked up a tray. We endure it because we have to, but it's not easy. At that moment, David fully understood the dimension of the test he was facing. It wasn't just about observing behavior. He was experiencing firsthand the systematic cruelty that these business people inflicted on people they considered inferior. And the night was just beginning. But he didn't imagine that Patricia Jones had much more humiliating plans for him. At 8:45 p.m., the party was at its peak. The main hall was packed with business people, all anxiously awaiting the arrival of the mysterious investor. David circulated between the kitchen and the hall, performing minor tasks but mostly observing and recording every cruel interaction. That's when Patricia approached him again, this time accompanied by 2 other women David recognized as wives of influential business people. You, she called, pointing directly at him. I need you to carry some things from my car. David nodded, following the group toward the mansion's parking lot. The night air was fresh, a welcome change from the suffocating atmosphere of the hall. In the parking lot, Patricia pointed to a black Mercedes-Benz AMG G63, a vehicle that cost more than $800,000. There are some boxes in the trunk, gifts for the hostess, she explained, extending the keys toward David. When he reached out to take the keys, Patricia purposely let them fall to the ground. Oops, she said with a fake smile. How clumsy. David bent down to pick up the keys, but the moment he stood up, Patricia had taken several steps back, forcing him to walk toward her to return the keys. Actually, she said as he approached. "Before you open the car, how about you clean my shoes? I stepped in something nasty back there." David looked at her shoes, impeccable Louboutin stilettos, clearly without any dirt. "Ma'am, they seem to be—" "Are you contradicting me?" Patricia interrupted, her voice acquiring a dangerous tone. Her two companions exchanged knowing glances. "No, ma'am." "Then do what I'm asking." David looked around. There were other guests in the parking lot, some getting into cars, others arriving late to the party. All eyes turned to the scene unfolding. "With what, ma'am?" Patricia smiled with pure malice. "Use your shirt." David felt his blood run cold. The request was absurd, humiliating, and completely unnecessary, but he remembered Robert's words. These business people constantly tested limits. "Ma'am, maybe I could get a cloth from the kitchen." "I said use your shirt," Patricia cut in. "Unless you'd prefer I tell Veronica that you refuse to follow simple instructions." Her companions giggled softly, clearly enjoying the spectacle. Other guests began to form a small circle, some discreetly taking photos with their phones. David took a deep breath. He knew Isabella would arrive in a few minutes. He just needed to hold on a little longer. Reluctantly, he took off his white t-shirt, feeling the cold night air against his skin. The murmurs around him intensified, some of approval for the humiliation, others of discomfort with the obvious cruelty of the situation. Kneeling on the asphalt, David began to clean Patricia's shoes with his t-shirt. There was no dirt to remove, but he simulated the movements while she kept one foot propped on a small step, forcing him into an even more submissive position. "Better," she said after a few eternal minutes. "Now the other one." David repeated the process, feeling every gaze on him, registering every muffled laugh, engraving in his memory every face that showed pleasure in his humiliation. When he finished, he put on his t-shirt quickly. The fabric was dirty from the asphalt, but he ignored the discomfort. "Now you can get the boxes," Patricia said, tossing the keys to him one more time. David opened the trunk and found 3 elegantly wrapped gift boxes. They weren't heavy. One person could easily carry them. But Patricia had clearly planned that situation specifically to humiliate him. When they returned to the hall, the story had already spread. David noticed the glances, the whispered comments, the smiles of superiority. Edward Miller approached him in the kitchen. "I hear you did a good job in the parking lot," Edward commented with a cruel smile. "That's how real men should behave, knowing their place." "Yes, sir," David murmured. "You know what the problem with society is today?" Edward continued, clearly wanting an audience for his speech. "Failed men think they deserve respect, even though they haven't achieved anything in life." Marcus joined the conversation. "Exactly. In my business, I only promote men who show results. The others stay exactly where they should, serving those who have really built something." "But at least this one understands the hierarchy," Edward said, giving David a condescending pat on the shoulder. He did exactly what a successful woman asked for, without questioning. David clenched his fists, but kept his expression neutral. "I was just doing my job." "And that's exactly it," Marcus agreed. "Your job is to obey, not to think, not to question, not to have an opinion. Obey." The two men walked away, laughing to themselves, leaving David alone with his growing anger. He discreetly checked his watch. 5 minutes to 9. Isabella should arrive any moment. Robert approached, offering a clean cloth. "For your shirt," he explained quietly. "I saw what happened out there." "Thanks," David said, wiping the remaining dirt from the fabric. "Man, you have a poker face," Robert murmured. "I would have exploded halfway through that." "Sometimes we have to endure difficult things to get what we want," David replied, more to himself than to Robert. "And what do you want?" David looked through the pass-through toward the hall, where the business people were talking animatedly about millions in business, about power, about superiority. "Justice," he answered simply. Robert followed his gaze, nodding slowly. "I want it too, but men like us rarely get it." David smiled for the first time that night. "You'd be surprised, Robert." At that moment they heard the sound of a car arriving, a smooth, powerful engine that David recognized immediately. Isabella had arrived, and the real party was about to begin. The sound of Isabella's Porsche Cayenne engine echoed through the parking lot, but David knew she would still take a few minutes to make her grand entrance. Isabella always calculated these moments with precision. She would arrive promptly at 9, allowing the anticipation to build among the guests. But before he could savor the anticipation of the revenge that was approaching, Veronica entered the kitchen with an expression that mixed nervousness and irritation. "The investor has arrived," she announced to the team. "I want everything to be perfect from now on." "Everything?" her gaze fixed on David, analyzing his stained shirt with obvious disapproval. "You," she pointed at him, "can't circulate like that. You're not presentable." "I can change my shirt, ma'am," David suggested. "There's no time for that." Veronica looked around, clearly searching for a solution. "Anna, do you have an extra blouse?" "Not one that would fit him, Mrs. Williams." Veronica sighed with exasperation. "Then you'll have to stay in the kitchen until the party is over. I can't allow the guests to see a sloppy employee." "But, Mom, I need tonight's pay." "You should have thought of that before you got your only shirt dirty," she cut in coldly. David was about to protest when Edward Miller entered the kitchen, apparently looking for something. "Veronica, darling, do you have any chilled champagne? I want to make a toast when the investor arrives." "Of course, Edward." Veronica turned to David. "Go get a bottle of Dom Perignon from the cellar." "It's in the basement." David nodded, heading for the stairs that led to the mansion's basement. Edward followed him, apparently wanting to personally supervise the champagne selection. The cellar was impressive. Stone walls, controlled temperature, hundreds of bottles organized by region and vintage. David quickly located the French champagne section. "That bottle costs more than your salary for 3 months, Edward commented, when David picked up a bottle of Dom Perignon Vintage 2008. "Yes, sir. You know the difference between us?" Edward approached, invading David's personal space. "I can buy a bottle like this without a second thought. You'll probably never even have the money to taste it." David kept his eyes down, holding the bottle carefully. "More than that," Edward continued, "I built an empire from scratch. You're here cleaning a woman's shoes in the parking lot." The comment was like a punch to the stomach, but David took a deep breath. "That's life, sir." That's not life." Edward positioned himself directly in front of David, blocking his exit. "It's a choice. I chose to be ambitious. You chose to be mediocre." David looked up for the first time, meeting Edward's gaze. For an instant, the businessman saw something in David's eyes that made him hesitate, a spark of intelligence and determination that didn't match the expected submissiveness. "Excuse me, sir. Can I pass?" Edward narrowed his eyes but moved aside. "You can, but remember what I said." They returned to the kitchen in silence, where Veronica was waiting anxiously. "The champagne," David said, handing her the bottle. "Good. Now go wash dishes until the party is over," Veronica ordered. "And don't leave the kitchen for any reason." David headed to the sink, beginning to wash the accumulated plates. Through the pass-through between the kitchen and the hall, he could see the guests moving with growing anticipation. Veronica circulated among them, clearly nervous about the investor's presence. That's when he heard Isabella's voice for the first time that night. "Good evening, everyone." Her voice cut through the buzz of the hall like a sharp blade, clear, confident, filled with natural authority. David smiled involuntarily, continuing to wash dishes as he listened to the commotion in the hall. "Mrs. Adams," Veronica practically screamed with enthusiasm, "what a pleasure to have you here. I hope you found everything to your liking." "The environment is interesting," Isabella replied, and David caught the subtle tone of judgment in her voice. "You have a diverse team." David knew Isabella had observed everything upon arrival: the segregated employees in the kitchen, the obvious division of tasks by gender, the atmosphere of superiority that permeated the environment. "We always seek excellence in all aspects," Veronica replied quickly. "I understand. And where can I meet the business people with whom I would potentially do business?" David heard footsteps heading toward the center of the hall, where he presumed the formal introductions would begin. This was his cue to position himself to observe everything without being noticed. He moved silently to the pass-through between the kitchen and the hall, positioning himself behind a decorative column where he could see everything without being easily seen. Isabella was radiant. She was wearing an elegant black Valentino dress, Christian Louboutin shoes, and discreet but expensive jewelry. Her posture was impeccable, erect, confident, every movement calculated to demonstrate power without ostentation. "Mrs. Adams," Edward stepped forward, extending his hand. "Edward Miller of Miller Constructions, it's an honor to meet you." "The pleasure is mine, Mr. Miller." "Patricia Jones," the second person introduced herself. "Jones Hotel Group. Marcus Taylor of Taylor Hotels." The introductions continued, each business person trying to impress Isabella with their accomplishments and achievements. David observed everything, knowing that in a few minutes the mask of civility would fall. "Well," Isabella said after everyone had introduced themselves, "before we discuss business, I'd like to get to know how you operate better. After all, it's $300 million in investments." "Of course," Veronica hurried to reply. "What would you like to know specifically?" Isabella smiled, a smile David recognized as dangerous. How you treat your employees, for example. It says a lot about a person's character how they treat those they consider inferior. The silence that followed was deafening, and David knew that the moment of truth had arrived. The silence in the hall stretched for a few eternal seconds. David saw the business people exchange quick glances, each mentally calculating how to answer Isabella's seemingly innocent question. Edward was the first to break the silence, forcing a confident smile. "What an interesting question, Mrs. Adams. I believe that respectful treatment of employees is fundamental to the success of any company." "I completely agree," Patricia hurried to add. "At the Jones Group, we always prioritize the well-being of our team. Happy employees are productive employees." Isabella nodded slowly, but David noticed the calculating glint in her eyes. "That's wonderful to hear," she said, "and I imagine this applies to all employees, regardless of gender or hierarchical position?" "Absolutely," Marcus affirmed with vehemence. "We don't make distinctions. Man, woman, manager, or general helper. Everyone is treated with equal dignity." David almost choked on the blatant hypocrisy. Less than an hour ago, the same Marcus had made jokes about failed men and talked about keeping employees in their place. "How progressive," Isabella commented, accepting a glass of champagne that Veronica offered her. "And you? Same philosophy?" "Without a doubt," Veronica replied quickly. "Elegant Events has always maintained the highest standards of human treatment. Our employees are our family." Isabella took a sip of the champagne, savoring both the drink and the blatant lie she had just heard. "Family, what a beautiful word," she murmured. "And I'm sure that philosophy is reflected in how you interact with employees from other companies as well. Waiters, security guards, cleaning staff." "Of course," Edward exclaimed, maybe a little too loudly. "We always treat everyone with the utmost respect." David watched Isabella slowly circulate among the group, like a predator studying its prey. "What a relief," she said finally. "You have no idea how many business people I've met who acted charming with me, but were absolutely cruel to employees they considered inferior. People like that are deplorable," Patricia stated with conviction. "Luckily, we are nothing like that." "I imagine not," Isabella smiled. "After all, a person's true character is revealed in how they act when they think no one important is watching." David saw some of the business people's posture change slightly. Isabella's phrase had been loaded with meaning. "Exactly," Marcus agreed, but his voice sounded less convinced than before. Isabella approached Veronica, who was visibly nervous. "Veronica, dear, you coordinated this party wonderfully. I'm sure your team worked very hard." "Yes, they worked a lot. And you treated them well, I hope, knowing how important it is to keep employees motivated." "Naturally. As I said, they are like family." Isabella nodded slowly, but David saw that she had caught the hesitation. "Wonderful," she said. "You can go back to work. Thank you for your dedication." The employees left, but Isabella held David with a quick glance. "You, wait a moment." David stopped, his heart pounding. The business people approached, curious about what Isabella wanted with a simple employee. "What's your name?" she asked. "David, ma'am." "David, you look familiar. Have we met?" David shook his head, keeping his eyes down. "No, ma'am. I'm sure I would remember." Isabella smiled, a smile that only David could interpret correctly. "How interesting. Well, David, I hope you were treated well tonight." "Yes, ma'am." "Good." Isabella turned to the business people. "What a well-trained team you have. So obedient." The word hung in the air like a veiled accusation. "Now," Isabella continued, "how about you tell me exactly how the night went? How you interacted with these dedicated employees?" David slowly retreated toward the kitchen, but remained where he could hear everything. The trap was set, and the business people were about to fall for it, head first. Isabella positioned herself elegantly in the center of the hall, the champagne glass in her right hand, while the business people formed a semicircle around her. The light from the crystal chandeliers created an almost theatrical atmosphere for what was about to happen. "So," she began, her voice melodious but filled with authority, "I'd like to better understand your management philosophy before we commit $300 million. Edward stepped forward, clearly anxious to make a good impression. "Mrs. Adams, I can speak for my company when I say we always value the human element above all. At Miller Constructions, we believe that respected employees are productive employees." "How interesting," Isabella commented, taking a sip of the champagne. "And does that apply to all hierarchical levels?" "Absolutely. From the president to the simplest helper, Everyone is treated with equal dignity. David, hidden behind the kitchen pass-through, almost laughed at the blatant hypocrisy. Less than 2 hours ago, the same Edward had called employees failures and made comments about men who couldn't make it in life. How progressive, Isabella observed. And you, Patricia, same philosophy in the hotel industry? Patricia approached, radiating false confidence. Completely, Isabella. At the Jones Group, we have a motto: respect breeds excellence. Our male employees receive the exact same treatment as our female employees. Fascinating, Isabella murmured. And I imagine that includes temporary employees as well? People you don't know well? Without a doubt, Patricia stated categorically. Respect doesn't depend on the length of the employment contract. David closed his eyes, remembering the humiliation in the parking lot. Patricia had forced him to clean her shoes with his own shirt, in front of dozens of people, for the pure pleasure of degrading him. Isabella turned to Marcus. And you? How do you deal with employees you consider inferior? That's the thing, Isabella, Marcus replied with a rehearsed smile. I don't consider anyone inferior. At Taylor Hotels, all employees are valuable members of the team, even those in simpler positions, waiters, for example. Especially them, Marcus lied shamelessly. They are the face of the company for our guests. Isabella nodded slowly, but David knew she was cataloguing every lie. And you, Veronica, as an event organizer, you must deal with many temporary employees. Veronica swallowed hard before answering. Isabella, my company has existed for 20 years because we treat everyone with the utmost dignity. Men, women, temporary, permanent. We don't make distinctions. How wonderful, Isabella commented. And I'm sure that philosophy was reflected in how you treated your team tonight. Absolutely, Veronica affirmed, but her voice trembled slightly. Isabella walked slowly through the group, like a general inspecting troops. Do you know why this issue is so important to me? She asked rhetorically. Because I've been betrayed by partners who seemed ethical in business meetings, but were cruel to employees. It's a valid concern, Edward agreed. Very valid, Isabella continued. For example, I've met business people who made employees perform humiliating tasks, who treated them like objects instead of people. The discomfort in the hall was palpable now. David saw beads of sweat on Veronica's forehead, noticed Patricia shifting her weight from one foot to the other nervously. People like that are despicable, Patricia declared, the irony completely escaping her. I completely agree, Isabella said. Imagine forcing an employee to kneel on the floor to perform unnecessary tasks, just to demonstrate power. David saw Patricia turn slightly pale, but she maintained her composure. That would be inadmissible, she replied. Or making derogatory comments about masculinity and professional success, Isabella continued, her eyes fixed on Edward. Completely inappropriate, Edward agreed quickly. Or segregating employees based on gender, specifically assigning heavier jobs to men as a form of punishment, she added, looking directly at Veronica. I would never do something like that, Veronica lied. Isabella took the last sip of her champagne, placing the empty glass on a nearby table. What a relief to know that I'm dealing with people of integrity, she said finally. Because you know I have my own particular methods for evaluating people's character. What kind of methods? Marcus asked, a hint of nervousness in his voice. Isabella smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Very effective methods, she replied mysteriously. For example, I sometimes like to observe how potential partners behave when they believe no one important is watching. The silence that followed was charged with electric tension. But luckily, Isabella continued, I'm sure you are exactly the people of integrity you claim to be. Edward forced a nervous laugh. Of course we are. Good, Isabella said, clapping her hands once. Then you won't mind if I bring in a witness to how you behaved tonight. A witness, Veronica repeated, confused. Yes, Isabella confirmed, her smile becoming predatory. Someone who was here observing every interaction, every word, every gesture. The business people exchanged alarmed glances. Who? Patricia asked, her voice barely a whisper. Isabella looked directly at the kitchen pass-through, where David was hidden. Darling, she called, her voice now filled with absolute authority. Can you come here, please? David took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and walked toward the main hall, but this time not as a submissive employee. This time, as the husband of the most powerful woman in the room. David emerged from the kitchen, but his transformation was instant and dramatic. The shoulders that had been hunched all night straightened, the chin that had stayed low lifted, and his steps acquired the natural confidence of someone accustomed to power. Even more impressively, his entire body posture changed, from a submissive employee to a confident executive in a matter of seconds. The hall fell into a deadly silence. Edward was the first to frown, realizing something was wrong with the transformation. "What's going on here?" Isabella extended her hand to David, who took it naturally, intertwining their fingers with intimate familiarity. "Business people," Isabella said, her voice now filled with an icy authority. "I'd like to introduce my husband, David Thomas Adams." The color drained from Veronica's face. Patricia let out a strangled sound. Marcus staggered slightly, as if he had been punched in the stomach. "Your husband?" Edward repeated, incredulous. "My husband for 5 years," Isabella confirmed, raising her left hand where the diamond wedding ring sparkled under the chandelier lights. "And my partner in all of our company's businesses." David finally spoke, his voice now clear and firm, without any trace of the feigned submission. "Good evening. It was an educational experience working with you tonight." Patricia took a step back, her hands visibly trembling. This can't be true." "Oh, but it's completely true," Isabella replied. "David arrived here at 6:30 p.m., disguised as a temporary employee, with a very specific mission." "What mission?" Veronica asked, her voice barely a hoarse whisper. "To evaluate the moral character of potential business partners," David explained calmly. "Before my wife invested $300 million with you, we wanted to be sure we were dealing with people of integrity." Edward tried to regain his composure, forcing a nervous laugh. "Well, that's creative, but I'm sure there was some misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" Isabella interrupted, her voice as sharp as a razor. "David told me everything on the phone throughout the night. Every humiliation, every cruel comment, every moment of gratuitous sadism." "Sadism is a strong word," Marcus tried to argue. "It's the exact word," David cut in. "Marcus, you said, and I quote textually, 'The problem with employees these days is that they no longer know their place.'" Marcus turned pale. I don't remember saying that. "You also said that men in service positions always want to show off, give their opinion, and that in your business you only promote men who show results, leaving the others exactly where they should, serving those who have really built something." Isabella turned to Edward. "And you, Edward, were even more specific about your opinions." Edward swallowed hard, sweat beginning to form beads on his forehead. "You said that failed men have no dignity whatsoever, and that the problem with society is failed men who think they deserve respect, even though they haven't achieved anything in life." "That was taken out of context." Edward tried to defend himself. "Context," David repeated. "The context was you humiliating me while I was carrying drinks that cost more than many people's monthly salary." Isabella turned to Patricia, who was already visibly trembling. "And you, Patricia, were truly creative in your cruelty." "I didn't do anything." "You forced my husband to clean your shoes with his own shirt," Isabella declared, her voice rising in volume and intensity. "In the parking lot in front of dozens of people, for pure sadistic pleasure. The shoes were dirty." "Lie!" Isabella screamed, making everyone in the hall jump. "There wasn't a single stain on your Louboutin shoes. You invented non-existent dirt to force a man to publicly humiliate himself." Patricia began to cry, tears smudging her carefully applied makeup. Isabella finally turned to Veronica, who was leaning against the wall as if she needed physical support. "And you, Veronica, were systematic in your cruelty. Or deliberate segregation of employees by gender, comments about men who do manual labor, threats to destroy David's career if he didn't completely submit. I was just maintaining professional standards." "Standards?" Isabella exploded. "You told my husband that he was invisible, that his job was to do what you're told when you're told without questioning." The silence that followed was broken only by Patricia's stifled sobs. David took a step forward, his presence now dominating the hall. "For 3 hours," he said, his voice firm but controlled, "you treated me like an object, not as a human being, but as something to be used, humiliated, degraded. You showed sadistic pleasure in exercising power over someone you considered inferior," Isabella added. "You revealed exactly who you are when you believe you are in a position of unpunished power." Edward made one last desperate attempt to save the situation. "Look, this was a misunderstanding. We can resolve this civilly." "Resolve?" Isabella laughed, but there was no humor in her laughter. "Edward, do you think there's a resolution for systematic sadism? We didn't know who he was." "Exactly," Isabella screamed again. You didn't know who he was, so you felt free to psychologically torture him. David placed a hand on his wife's shoulder, calming her slightly. The issue, Edward, is that this reveals who you really are. If you treated me well just knowing I was rich, that wouldn't mean anything about your character. But now, Isabella continued, regaining her icy composure, we know exactly what kind of people we would be doing business with. Veronica made one last desperate attempt. Please, Mrs. Adams, this can be resolved. We can learn from this. Learn? Isabella repeated incredulously. Veronica, you're in your 40s and 50s. If you haven't learned basic humanity yet, you never will. The weight of the situation finally hit all the business people simultaneously. It wasn't just about the 300 million they were losing. It was about the consequences they were about to face, and David wasn't done yet. Isabella walked slowly to the coffee table in the center of the hall, where there was an Italian leather portfolio she had brought with her. With deliberate movements, she opened the portfolio and took out a series of documents, spreading them on the glass surface like cards in a deadly poker game. You know, she began, her voice now frighteningly calm, for the past 3 months my legal and investigative team has conducted a detailed analysis of all your companies. The business people approached instinctively, as if fossilized in their place, but unable to resist the morbid curiosity. Edward, Isabella picked up the first document, Miller Constructions, pending contracts worth $215 million. Interesting coincidence. They all depend on bank approvals that depend on letters of recommendation. Edward turned even paler. What are you implying? I'm not implying anything, Isabella replied, smiling coldly. I'm stating 3 of your biggest contracts depend on financing from Chase Bank and Bank of America, banks where, coincidentally, I have significant shares on the administrative boards. You can't. I can, and I will, Isabella cut in. Starting Monday, all your credit applications will be re-evaluated considering issues of moral character of the leadership. David watched Edward mentally collapse, understanding the devastating implications. Isabella picked up the second document. Patricia, dear, Jones Hotel Group, 83 million in planned expansions, including 2 hotels in Miami and 1 in Las Vegas. Patricia could barely speak. Isabella, please. The investments are conditioned on social sustainability certifications, Isabella continued relentlessly. Certifications that, curiously, are issued by organizations where I have considerable influence. What does that mean? Patricia whispered. It means that companies proven to be involved in practices of systematic humiliation and gender discrimination will not receive such certifications. David felt a grim satisfaction seeing Patricia understand that her dreams of expansion had just turned to dust. Marcus, Isabella continued, picking up the third document. Taylor Hotels. What a shame to discover that your main suppliers have exclusive contracts with me through my holding company. Marcus took a staggering step back. You can't cancel supply contracts for personal reasons. Personal reasons, Isabella repeated, genuinely surprised. Marcus, this isn't personal. It's purely professional. I cannot, in good conscience, maintain business partnerships with companies that demonstrate values incompatible with ours. What values? He asked desperately. Basic human dignity, David replied simply. Isabella turned to Veronica, who was leaning against the wall, visibly trembling. And finally, Veronica. Elegant events, 20 years of business, a select clientele, impeccable reputation. Isabella, please, I beg you. You had an impeccable reputation, Isabella corrected, because, you see, New York's elite is a very small circle, and when stories start circulating about event organizers who systematically humiliate employees— What stories? Veronica asked, genuine terror in her voice. David smiled for the first time since revealing his identity. The stories that I am personally going to tell every important client I know, and considering that my wife and I frequent the same social circles as your clients— You can't do that, Veronica said, but her voice lacked conviction. I can, and I will, Isabella confirmed. In fact, I've already started. On the way here, I called a few influential friends, wives of CEOs, organizers of charity events, women who control budgets of millions in social events. What did you tell them? The truth, Isabella replied simply, that you are people who take pleasure in humiliating employees, who show sadism when you believe you are in positions of unpunished power. The hall fell into a deadly silence, only the sound of Patricia's contained sobs breaking the tension. Edward made one last desperate attempt. Isabella, this is out of proportion. We can resolve this civilly. Civilly, David repeated, his voice filled with disbelief. Edward, you forced me to polish your shoes while making jokes about failed men. Where was your civility? And you, Patricia, Isabella added, forced my husband to clean your shoes with his own shirt in the parking lot for your personal entertainment. Where was your civility? Veronica, David continued, you systematically humiliated me, made comments about my inferiority, threatened me with professional consequences if I didn't completely submit. Where was your civility? And Marcus, Isabella finalized, you made jokes about failed masculinity and lack of dignity. Where was your civility exactly? The four business people were now completely defeated, understanding that no negotiation was possible. Please, Veronica whispered, our employees, and they'll lose their jobs. Isabella paused, considering the argument. You're right, she said finally. Innocent employees shouldn't suffer for the cruel actions of their bosses. For a moment, a spark of hope shone in the business people's eyes. That's why, Isabella continued, I will offer employment opportunities to all your employees who wish to work in companies with genuine human values. Hope turned into total despair. Now, Isabella said, beginning to collect the documents, I suggest you use the time you have left to reflect on the choices you made. How much time? Edward asked, his voice broken. Isabella looked at David, who checked his watch, the Cartier he had kept hidden all night. The first calls will be made at 9 a.m. on Monday, David replied. That gives you approximately 60 hours to, as you would say, know your place. Isabella closed the portfolio and headed for the door, David at her side. On the way out, she turned one last time. Oh, and feel free to stay at the party. After all, it's already paid for. The couple left in silence, leaving behind 4 destroyed careers and a lesson that would never be forgotten. But the true lesson was still to come. 1 week later, Isabella and David were in the main office of their company, located on the top floor of a commercial building on Fifth Avenue. The glass windows offered a panoramic view of New York, and on the mahogany executive desk were detailed reports of the consequences of the party night. Edward Miller, David read aloud from the first report, lost 3 major contracts totaling $215 million. The construction company has already laid off 40% of its staff. But we offered positions to all qualified employees, Isabella commented, signing a letter of employment. 28 people have already been incorporated into our partner companies. David picked up the second report. Patricia Jones, the 2 hotels in Miami were cancelled. The Las Vegas project was suspended indefinitely. 17 employees from the hotel group accepted our job offers, Isabella added, including 3 managers who reported years of systematic humiliation at her company. Marcus Taylor, David continued, lost major suppliers. 3 hotels have already closed due to a lack of basic supplies. 31 employees transferred to our partnerships, Isabella recorded. Some reported disturbing stories about the work environment there. David picked up the last report, the most extensive. Veronica Williams, Elegant Events. Lost 85% of her clientele in 1 week. 5 major events were cancelled at the last minute. Isabella sighed, placing her pen on the desk. 42 employees from Elegant accepted our offers, including Maria and Robert, who worked with us that night. David stood up, walking to the window. The afternoon sun painted the city gold, creating an impressive view that usually calmed him. But today, he felt a different weight in his chest. Bella, he said without turning, do you think we went too far? Isabella joined him at the window, placing her hand on his shoulder. Are you regretting it? Not exactly regretting, David replied thoughtfully. But we destroyed 4 companies. Hundreds of people lost their jobs even though we offered alternatives. David, look at me. He turned to face his wife's worried eyes. Do you remember what you said that night? About justice? David nodded. It wasn't revenge, Isabella continued. It was a consequence. People in positions of power have responsibilities proportional to the power they wield. But the consequences were severe. They were proportional to the harm they caused, Isabella argued. David, you only saw 1 night. How many employees do you think they've humiliated over the years? How many people suffered in silence? David remembered Robert's comments about employees who left Veronica's parties, vowing they would never come back. He remembered the stories the new employees told about years of systematic humiliation. You're right, he murmured. More than that, Isabella added. We created opportunities for genuinely competent people. Remember, Maria. David smiled slightly. the most experienced employee from Elegant, had become a supervisor at one of Isabella's partner companies, earning double her previous salary. And Robert, event coordinator at our holding company, he told me yesterday that for the first time in 10 years, he feels his work is valued. David turned back to the window, but now his expression was lighter. You know what the hardest part of all this was? He asked. What? Keeping my composure during the humiliations. There were moments when I wanted to explode, to reveal who I was, to end the charade. Isabella laughed softly. And why didn't you? Because I knew the goal was bigger. It wasn't about me, but about all the people they had humiliated and would humiliate in the future. Exactly, Isabella confirmed. You sacrificed your momentary pride to protect the future dignity of hundreds of people. They stood in silence for a few minutes, watching the movement of the city below. Bella, David said finally, do you think they learned anything? Isabella considered the question carefully. I think they learned that actions have consequences. Whether that will transform them into better people, I don't know. But at least they are no longer in positions where they can cause systematic harm. David nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. And now? What do we do with the $300 million we plan to invest? Isabella smiled, the first genuinely happy smile of the week. We invest in people who demonstrate values compatible with ours. I've already identified 3 promising companies, all run by people who treat employees as human beings. How did you evaluate them? Conventional methods, Isabella laughed. I'm not disguising you as an employee again anytime soon. David laughed too, hugging his wife. Good. I'm not sure I could handle another night like that. It wouldn't be necessary, Isabella murmured against his chest. The lesson has already been given. Now it's time to focus on building something positive. They stood embraced in front of the window, watching New York prepare for the night. But this time it was a night of possibilities, not of humiliation. A night where human dignity had been restored, and where justice, finally, had prevailed. 2 months after the party, Isabella and David received an unexpected visitor in their office. Robert, now an event coordinator at one of the partner companies, brought news that echoed far beyond New York's business circles. You're not going to believe what's happening, Robert said, settling into the leather armchair in front of Isabella's desk. His face was lit up with a mix of satisfaction and disbelief. Tell me everything, Isabella asked, offering him an espresso. Remember Maria, the older employee from Elegant? David nodded, remembering the woman who had lied to protect Veronica during Isabella's questioning. She reached out to 5 colleagues who worked at other event companies in the city, all with similar stories of systematic humiliation. And, Isabella prompted, they are suing their former companies for collective moral harassment. The lawyer said they have solid cases because they now have the courage to speak up. David leaned forward, interested. Did the story of our party inspire them? More than that, Robert confirmed. When the news spread about you exposing those business people, other people started to come forward. Employees from dozens of companies began to report similar treatment. Isabella exchanged a meaningful look with David. They had not anticipated that their action would trigger a larger movement. There's more, Robert continued, clearly excited. The New York Chamber of Commerce is creating a specific code of ethics about employee treatment. They called it the Dignity Protocol. Seriously? David asked, genuinely surprised. The president of the chamber said in an interview that recent events have shown the need for stricter standards for associated companies. Isabella smiled, satisfied. And the companies we affected? Any news? Robert's expression became more somber. Edward Miller filed for bankruptcy last week. But here's the interesting part. 3 of his former employees created a construction cooperative. They are getting some of the contracts he lost. How wonderful, Isabella commented genuinely. And Patricia, she sold the hotel chain to an international group, but the group kept all the employees you didn't hire. Apparently, the new management implemented strict policies of labor respect. David stood up, walking to the window. And Marcus? Marcus is trying to rebuild with only 2 hotels, but I heard he has completely changed his management style. The employees say he's a different person. And Veronica? Robert paused as if saving the best news for last. Veronica permanently closed Elegant. But get this, she's working as an employee at a smaller event company. As an employee? Isabella repeated, surprised. As an employee, Robert confirmed. Basic coordination, no leadership position. The owner of the company said she begged for the opportunity, promising to learn how to treat people with dignity. David returned to the desk, processing the information. That's unexpected. There's more, Robert continued. Anna, that employee who was with us at the party, works at the same company now. She told me that Veronica personally apologized to all the former employees of Elegant. Isabella was silent for a few moments, clearly reflecting on the implications. Robert, she said finally, do you think our action was just? Just, Robert repeated, surprised by the question. Mrs. Adams, you saved dozens of people from years of continuous humiliation. More than that, you inspired other people to stand up for themselves. But we destroyed careers, David observed. Careers built on the humiliation of others, Robert replied firmly. I can speak for all the employees I've met in this industry. You did something that no one else had the courage to do. Isabella got up, walking to a file where she kept important personal documents. Robert, I want to show you something. She took out a folder labeled DC 2020 and opened it on the desk. 5 years ago, we invested $15 million in a real estate project in DC. The business people seemed ethical. They talked about family values, social responsibility. Robert came closer to see the documents. We discovered later that they were systematically embezzling money, but the worst part wasn't the financial loss. What was it? Robert asked. We discovered that they regularly humiliated employees. They did the same things we witnessed at that party. We just didn't have the courage to act at the time. David complimented the story. We got angry, sued for financial losses, recovered some of the money, but we didn't do anything about the treatment of the employees. That haunted us for years, Isabella continued. How many people continued to suffer because we didn't have the courage to expose the systematic cruelty? Robert nodded slowly, understanding. That's why the party was different, David explained. It was our chance to not only protect our investments, but to really do justice. Isabella closed the folder, putting it away again. Robert, I want to ask a direct question. Do you think people like Edward, Patricia, Marcus, and Veronica deserve a second chance? Robert considered it carefully before answering. Mrs. Adams, I think everyone deserves a chance to change. But real change only happens when people face genuine consequences for their actions. And you think the consequences were proportional? I think they were necessary, Robert replied without hesitation. And from the results I'm seeing, I think they were effective too. David smiled, feeling a final weight lift from his shoulders. Thank you, Robert. We needed to hear that. Can I ask a question? Robert said hesitantly. Of course. Would you do it again? If you had to choose. Isabella and David looked at each other, communicating silently before Isabella replied, Robert, if we could go back in time, the only thing we would change is having acted sooner. Robert smiled, getting up to leave. Then I can say for sure you did the right thing. When he left, Isabella and David were alone in the office, watching the sun set through the panoramic windows. Bella, David said finally, I think I finally understand the difference between revenge and justice. What's the difference? Revenge is about making someone suffer. Justice is about preventing others from suffering. Isabella smiled, taking her husband's hand. And what was our case? David looked at the city below, thinking of all the people who now worked in more dignified environments, of all the companies that had changed their practices for fear of similar consequences. Justice, he answered finally. It was definitely justice. 3 months later, David was shopping at the Beverly Center when a familiar voice called his name. He turned and saw Veronica Williams approaching hesitantly, clearly nervous but determined to speak with him. David, she said, stopping a few feet away, Can I talk to you for a minute? David studied her face. Veronica was visibly different. Thinner, with dark circles that makeup couldn't completely hide, clothes much simpler than the designer suits she used to wear. Of course, he replied, indicating a nearby cafe. They sat at a discreet table in the back of the establishment. Veronica ordered only water, nervously fiddling with the strap of her purse, a simple bag, very different from the luxury items she used to display. I wanted to apologize, she began, avoiding eye contact, for what I did to you that night. David didn't answer immediately, allowing the silence to stretch. I want you to know I haven't slept well since then, Veronica continued. I couldn't stop thinking about how I treated you, about how I treated so many other people over the years. And why are you telling me this? David asked, genuinely curious. Because I need someone to know that I'm trying to change. Her hands trembled slightly. I started therapy. I'm working to understand why I took pleasure in humiliating people. David leaned slightly forward. And what did you discover? Veronica took a deep breath before answering. That I was reproducing what I suffered. My first boss, when I started in the events business, constantly humiliated me. He said I was useless, that I would only succeed if I was tough on employees. And you believed him? For years. I thought that being cruel to subordinates was a sign of strong leadership. She finally looked directly at David. But that night, when Isabella revealed who you were, I saw my reflection in your eyes. I saw the monster I had become. David took a sip of his coffee, processing her words. Veronica, can I ask you something? Anything. Are you apologizing because you're genuinely sorry, or because your life fell apart? The question was like a punch to the stomach. Veronica was silent for long minutes, tears beginning to form in her eyes. Initially, she admitted finally, it was because my life fell apart. I was angry. I wanted to blame you. And now I'm working as an employee at the company where I humiliated dozens of people over the years, and every day I see the reflection of what I did. David raised an eyebrow, interested. Anna worked with me at Elegant for 8 years. Every day I treated her as if she were invisible, disposable. Veronica wiped her tears with the back of her hand. Now she's my direct supervisor. How does she treat you? With dignity. Even knowing everything I did, she treats me like a human being. Veronica sobbed softly. It's more humiliating than any punishment you could have invented. David felt an unexpected pang of, not exactly sympathy, but a recognition of genuine humanity. Veronica, can I give you some advice? She nodded eagerly. Stop apologizing to me. I'm not the one who needs your repentance. Then who should I apologize to? To every employee you humiliated over the years. To every person you made cry. Who you degraded. Who you treated like an object. David leaned back. And most importantly, learn to apologize by doing things differently from now on. Veronica nodded slowly, understanding. David, can I ask one last question? You can. Do you forgive me? David considered the question carefully. Veronica, forgiveness is something very personal. I can't speak for the other people you hurt. But for you? For me? David smiled slightly. Veronica, you gave me a gift that night. A gift? She repeated, confused. You showed me exactly who I don't want to be. You taught me the value of genuine humility versus imposed humiliation. He stood up, preparing to leave. For that, there's nothing to forgive. There's only a lesson to be thankful for. Veronica remained seated, processing the words as David walked toward the cafe's exit. David, she called one last time. He turned. Thank you for showing me who I really was. David nodded once and continued walking, leaving Veronica alone with her thoughts and her personal transformation journey. But the story wasn't over yet. 1 year after the party that changed everything, Isabella and David were on the stage of the Dolby Theatre, being honored by the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce for excellence in business ethics. The audience was composed of hundreds of business people, journalists, and labor rights activists. Isabella approached the microphone, elegant in a navy blue dress that radiated professionalism without ostentation. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her clear voice echoing through the auditorium. Exactly 1 year ago, my husband and I made a decision that not only changed our lives, but apparently touched something bigger in our society. David watched from the side of the stage, proud of his wife's composure and eloquence. We decided that we could not in good conscience invest $300 million with people whose values were incompatible with ours, people who showed systematic cruelty to those they considered inferior. A murmur of approval ran through the auditorium. But what we discovered was that our individual action triggered something much bigger, a movement for human dignity in the workplace that spread far beyond New York. Isabella paused, allowing her words to resonate. Today, we receive reports from 12 states across the U.S. about changes in employee treatment policies. Companies that have implemented stricter codes of ethics, employees who have found the courage to report abuse. David joined her on stage, taking the microphone. But I want to be very clear about something, he said, his voice firm. We are not heroes. We are just two people who decided they couldn't ignore cruelty when they saw it firsthand. For 3 hours at that party, Isabella continued, my husband experienced firsthand what thousands of workers face daily. Systematic humiliation, contempt, inhumane treatment. The difference, David added, is that I had a way out. I had resources, support, a safety net. Most people who suffer this kind of abuse don't. Isabella nodded. For that, we don't celebrate our action as personal revenge. We celebrate it as a reminder that we all have a responsibility to protect human dignity. Especially, David emphasized, those of us in positions of power. A person in the audience raised their hand. Isabella indicated that they could speak. Do you have any regrets about the severity of the consequences you imposed? David and Isabella exchanged a look before David replied, "Our only regrets are not having acted sooner and not having better documented the abuses to help other victims." But, Isabella added, "we also learned that severe consequences are sometimes necessary for genuine change." 3 of the 4 people involved that night have undergone significant transformations. "And the 4th?" another audience member asked. "Still in process," David replied diplomatically. Isabella took the microphone again. "I want to share some statistics that our foundation compiled in the last year." She activated a presentation on the auditorium screens. 230 companies in New York implemented new employee treatment policies in the last 12 months. 1,400 workers reported significant improvements in their work environments. More impressively, David continued, we received 180 reports of employees who found the courage to report abuse after hearing our story. We also created a legal support fund, Isabella announced, for employees who want to report mistreatment but don't have the financial resources for legal proceedings. A journalist in the back of the auditorium raised their hand. "Isabella, David, what's the next step? Do you plan to expand this movement to other cities?" "Actually," Isabella smiled, "we're already doing that. Our foundation is implementing similar programs in Los Angeles, Chicago, and Miami. But," David added, "the most important thing is not our individual action. It's inspiring other people to act in their own communities." Isabella addressed the television camera, broadcasting the event live. "If you are watching and have witnessed mistreatment in your workplace, know that you are not alone. If you are in a leadership position and recognize problematic behaviors in yourself, know that it's never too late to change. And if you have power, financial, social, political, and choose to ignore the cruelty you see around you," David concluded, "remember that omission is also a choice." The auditorium rose in prolonged applause, but Isabella raised her hand, asking for silence for one last statement. "Before we finish, I want to invite someone to the stage, a person who genuinely represents what is possible when we face our own weaknesses and choose to change." The lights directed to the side of the stage, where a familiar figure emerged from the shadows. It was Veronica Williams. She walked slowly to the microphone, visibly nervous but determined. Her look was completely transformed. Simple but dignified clothes, natural hair, minimal makeup. "A year ago," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I was a cruel person. I took pleasure in humiliating employees, especially men I considered failures." The silence in the auditorium was absolute. "David and Isabella didn't destroy me. They saved me from myself." Tears began to run down her face. "I spent 10 months working as a common employee, being supervised by people I had humiliated for years. And do you know what I learned?" Veronica looked directly at the camera. "I learned that dignity doesn't depend on social position. I learned that cruelty is always a choice. And I learned that it's never too late to become a better person." She turned to David and Isabella. "Thank you for showing me who I really was, and for giving me the chance to discover who I could be." The auditorium exploded in applause. Many of those present visibly moved. Isabella took the microphone one last time. "This is our final message. The story of humanity is written by ordinary people who choose to do extraordinary things, not because they are heroes, but because they recognize their responsibility to one another. Choose to be part of the solution," David concluded. "Choose human dignity. Choose justice. And most importantly," Isabella finalized, "choose to act." The lights gradually dimmed as the applause continued. On the stage, 3 people who had experienced a profound transformation, 2 through the courage to act, 1 through the humility to change. Months later, when the final statistics were compiled, it was discovered that the event at the Dolby Theatre had been watched by more than 2 million people online. Hundreds of dignity operations were organized at companies across the US, where employees in leadership positions disguised themselves to evaluate how their teams treated colleagues from different hierarchical levels. The movement spread to other countries in Latin America, then to Europe, and finally became a global phenomenon known as the Isabella-David Protocol. But for David and Isabella, the true success was not in the global statistics. It was in the letter they received from Robert, now the owner of his own event company, treating all employees with the dignity he himself had never received. It was in the email from Maria, who had become a human resources director and implemented revolutionary policies of egalitarian treatment. It was in the photo that Anna sent of her business administration graduation, financed by the scholarship Isabella had created for former employees who suffered abuse. And it was in the genuine transformation of Veronica, who now coordinated a rehabilitation program for executives with abusive behaviors. 5 years later, when David and Isabella looked out the window of their office at the city of New York, they didn't just see skyscrapers and traffic. They saw a community where thousands of people worked with more dignity, where employees had the courage to report abuse, where business leaders thought twice before humiliating subordinates, where the phrase, "It's not personal, it's business," was no longer accepted as an excuse for cruelty. "Bella," David said, taking his wife's hand, "do you think our revenge was worth it?" Isabella smiled, squeezing his fingers. "David, it wasn't revenge. It was justice, and justice is always worth it." They continued watching the city, knowing that somewhere down there, a person in a position of power was choosing to treat an employee with dignity instead of disdain, and another person in a vulnerable position was finding the courage to stand up for themselves. And so the cycle of human dignity continued to spread, one choice at a time,